My name is Elizabeth Frost. I work as the technical specialist for honeybees in the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries in Australia. So the lesson we'll be going through provides info on two brood diseases. Those are American foulbrood and European foulbrood, which are present in most countries and continents. American foulbrood is a lethal disease, so that means it is fatal to the colony. So really important that you know what those signs and symptoms are, how to control and manage it. And European foulbrood, it's not usually lethal. However, it can cause a severe loss in production and should be identified early on in order to manage that in your hive. So we'll be looking at photos throughout this presentation. The one you see here is a sign that something's amiss in this colony. So we need to be able to figure out, is it a queen issue or is it a disease issue, possibly American foulbrood or European foulbrood. A telltale worrisome sign in this image is the two open cells. So we've got one here. It's got a ragged opening, not a regular opening. So when the bees are capping the cell, they cap it closed towards the center in a very regular kind of circle. And when they're opening up a cell, because they've sensed through smelling that something is amiss with that pupae underneath, they'll open it in this kind of a ragged hole here and here. And importantly, we also need to be able to discern and differentiate American foulbrood and European foulbrood from other brood diseases such as chalkbrood, which is what you see in this open cell. It's got this white kind of fluffy looking, malformed, I should say, off-shape larvae in it. So American foulbrood, we call it AFB for short. It's got a global distribution. It's present in most countries in the world where beekeeping is practiced and affects honeybee larval stages. And it is a notifiable disease. If you discover symptoms of American foulbrood, you must notify your state or territory apiary inspector or compliance hotline. With European foulbrood, or EFB, that's another bacterial brood disease, and it affects the larval and the pupal stages of honeybees as well. It occurs on most continents where honeybees are kept. So this one's a bit different from AFB. There's a little bit of localized absence of EFB. So if you're beekeeping in New Zealand, it's not present there. If you're beekeeping in certain states of Australia, it's not present. And like American foulbrood, it's also a notifiable disease. So as beekeepers, we really have to be sleuths in our hive. We have to know signs and symptoms of different pests and diseases. And in many states and territories around the world and different countries, it's the beekeeper's legal responsibility to manage these diseases. The first point that's vital for both these tasks is being able to inspect your hive. That's being able to look at every brood frame and look at all the cells twice a year. So that's a recommendation, and it's a legal recommendation in most of Australia, and it could apply globally very, very well in terms of we need to know what's going on in our hives with the status of the queen, with the health and the presence or absence of pests or diseases. So having removable frames, ensuring we're able to get those frames out safely, shake those bees off in order to get a very close look at the broods. In that first instance of AFB becoming symptomatic, it starts with one cell. So you need to be able to catch that one cell that the bees have chewed open or looks a bit sunken, the capping. So differentiating diseased brood from healthy brood. Here we can see on the top left, healthy brood, that's open larva. It's bright, pearly white, shiny, it's well fed. That's healthy in number 5. Number 6, we've got healthy capped brood. I would consider that queen well mated because it's a very solid pattern. Number 7, that's capped honey. There's a little bit of open pollen in the cells, those yellow cells. And then number 8, we've got a very nice frame of open pollen that the bees are storing. Conversely, we can look at a brood frame and see that this one is very patchy. So it's very scattered, the capped brood and the open brood. If it's not a queen issue, if it's a young queen, we need to think, is this a seasonal issue? Maybe the hive has too small a population, it's been chilled, some brood has died. If we have a closer look and we see those perforated or open cell cappings, we need to see what the state of that brood is. Is the larvae off color or misshapen? And does it behave like it has American foulbrood or European foulbrood? American foulbrood, it is a bacterial brood disease of the larval stages, so of the developmental stages of the honeybee, and it can affect any colony, strong colony, weak colony, mid-range strength colony, so it really pays for the beekeeper to be able to identify this. It's a very robust bacteria, so it can survive over 70 years, and very few spores are needed to cause an infection of larvae, so 6 to 10 spores. Why it's very important to be able to identify that first cell that becomes infected, that first cell that's being uncapped by workers and is having symptoms of American foulbrood, is because that one larvae could be producing 2.6 billion AFB spores. And remember, it only takes 6 to 10 to infect another larvae. So our signs and symptoms, initial infections, you'll see quite patchy or scattered brood patterns. And you'll need to ask yourself, is this because my queen's getting older, she's not laying as many eggs, or is that because there's a disease? So if you see sunken cappings, so generally healthy brood, it's got convex cappings, they're kind of pushed out, and unhealthy brood can have sunken or flat cappings. If that's the case, get a stick or a matchstick and open up that cell and look at what's inside. If it looks like this sunken brood in number 12, then you may have an AFB infection. So telltale signs, some apiary inspectors in the US will say the rope test is a good field test, and that's absolutely right. So with the rope test here in number 13, we use a matchstick or just a stick off the ground to probe that suspect infected larvae, and if it ropes out, that is a classic example of behavior of AFB infected larvae. We look for dark or sunken cappings as in number 14. Perforated cappings are shown as well in 14 and 16. With our American foulbrood symptoms, with intermediate infections, ideally you catch it before this stage, but here we can see that there's a pupal stage with its proboscis kind of stuck up to the top V of the cell. So that is another symptom, not to be seen in the early stages, however. So it's critical to be able to identify that sunken larvae in that perforated cell prior to that stage. And as the infection advances, some of the larvae will dry out, and they'll sink right down to the bottom of the cell and form this kind of a scale. Once they've fully dried out, it's actually a little bit difficult to see them. So very important that as you're holding the frame up, you orient it so the sun's coming over your shoulder, so it's shining that light directly into the bottom of the cell. Advanced infections, you can hold the frame up so that light is going to the bottom of the cell and see scales as in number 19, or vast quantities of sunken or perforated cappings as in number 18. And the colony eventually will die, so it's not a wait it out and hope for the best situation, unfortunately. We have to be very proactive with American foulbrood. European foulbrood, on the other hand, it is not fatal, but it can be confused with American foulbrood, so it's important to note the differences. So American foulbrood generally affects capped brood. European foulbrood generally affects uncapped brood. So with European foulbrood, we've got some classic symptoms. So patchy brood pattern, larval stages are affected, so that's before capping. Where European foulbrood affects uncapped larvae, it can cause the larvae to become discolored. So that'll vary from that beautiful pearly white color. They'll be off-white to yellowish in color, and they may twist in the cell and get a bit sunken. With European foulbrood, you must also notify your state or territory compliance officer or ag inspector and process that hive according to your region. So you could choose to treat it with antibiotics, or you could increase nutrition, move it to better nutrition, and see if the hive recovers with better conditions. In comparison to AFB, European foulbrood does not often rope when poked with a stick, and it's quite easy to remove from the open cell. So we'll talk about our fundamental differences between European foulbrood and American foulbrood because it's important to differentiate the two. So we've got two different species of bacteria. European foulbrood occurs very seasonally. So generally springtime, autumn are very common times of the year to see this, and when hives are nutritionally stressed. And the beekeeper can take strategic management in order to prevent that from happening. With European foulbrood, that bacteria is always present. It's just stressful conditions that cause the hive to break down with it. And American foulbrood, it is possible to eliminate it from the system. So it is legal to treat European foulbrood anywhere in Australia. Obviously, New Zealand doesn't have European foulbrood. North America does, and it is also legal to treat for European foulbrood with antibiotics. And for those recommendations and guidelines, you should talk to your state ag department. With American foulbrood, it is illegal to treat for antibiotics in Australia, say for Tasmania, and that is because it doesn't kill the causative agent, so the spores, it only kills the vegetative state. So in the US, it is legal to use antibiotics to treat American foulbrood, but again, it's not advised. Most state ag departments would not advise it because there will be antibiotic residue in your honey after that treatment. And it doesn't kill the causative agent. There are other management methods for preventing European foulbrood without the use of antibiotics. So good nutrition and ample nutrition is a very important way of prevention. European foulbrood often becomes symptomatic in spring or autumn when we've got temperature fluctuations, potential cold snaps, or a dearth of pollen and nectar resources. So if the colony is nutritionally stressed, that's a chance where these opportunistic diseases can challenge the colony more, and some colonies may break down. So prevention methods can be increasing good nutrition through a pollen supplement or moving your hives to an area where there is more pollen from different species available. You can also ensure that your colony's got its best chance at production and strength and immunity through having a young, well-mated queen. So we'll go through here to prevention of American foulbrood, which is different to European foulbrood. So once we've found that symptom of the fatal bee disease, American foulbrood, we want to prevent drifting between colonies. We want to, before all these symptoms occur, ideally not be exchanging equipment between one colony and the other. If we are very pedantic, we can wash our hive tools in our hands or use disposable gloves in between hives. These recommendations are from Penn State Extension University, so they would be adopted in Australia as well. So it's really important with American foulbrood that we not exchange equipment in between hives in order to guarantee that if we have an infection in hive number 1, we know that no equipment has been shared to hive number 2, what we call a barrier system in Australia. So a barrier system is where a beekeeper returns all honey supers to a specific hive and they never get mixed in between hives. And this is a really important method to ensure that when you do have an American foulbrood symptom that you've seen, you can trace all those honey supers back to that one hive. So it gives you a really strong guarantee that you've got all that infected equipment in one place. Comb culling on a 3-year cycle is another great way of keeping spore levels down. So this is recommended in order to manage against many different diseases, bee diseases. So it not only keeps down bacterial or fungal pathogens, it also eliminates some chemicals that bees are bringing back to the hive and get sucked up by the wax in the honeycomb, which acts as a bit of a sponge when bees that have been foraging in an urban or rural setting or a cropping setting bring back some agrochemicals or household chemicals to the hive. So buying new equipment is extremely important because you're sure if it's brand new, no bees have been in that equipment, there is no chance that there are any bacterial spores, fungal pathogens, agrochemicals, etc. in that equipment. So you're giving your bees a great start. For American Foulbrood, there are high-risk activities and low-risk activities. So contaminated combs and contaminated hive equipment is an extreme risk and high risk, as well as not catching an infection early enough and a hive is starting to die out and gets robbed out by healthy hives. So once a hive is infected, it will have AFB spores throughout all the frames, the bottom board, the boxes, the queen excluder, the lid. So if that hive gets robbed out by healthy colonies or more than one colony, then they will bring those spores back to the hive, and eventually those hives will become infected and break down with it as well. One infected larvae can have 2.6 billion spores, and a healthy larvae only needs 6 to 10 spores to become infected with American Foulbrood. So in Australia, we do not recommend feeding honey ever back to bees because of the high risk of contamination with bacterial spores that are infective to honeybees. Collection of swarms is very low risk. Some of you will be happy to hear that because it is quite exciting to catch a swarm occasionally. And queen bees and foundation, also extremely low risk of transmission of American Foulbrood. Inspection rate and frequency is very important. Obviously, you don't want to go in your hive too much and mess with its hive temperature. But you definitely want to look at every single brood frame without bees on it, so you can have a look at all the cells, all those brood cells, and look for any suspect larvae or catkins. Record keeping of that activity is also important for your own knowledge, but potentially as a legal requirement in different states and territories. With diagnosis, most of us will be diagnosing this disease from visual symptoms alone. However, in countries, states, or territories where they exist, you can send samples off to a lab. They will undertake microscopic diagnosis and send you the results back, positive, negative. Is it American Foulbrood or European Foulbrood? If those don't exist, there are field test kits. Vita Bee Health is one that is used by our compliance officers here in Australia to do a test in the field. You can also send in Australia a pooled honey sample. So once you've extracted honey from an apiary, you decant a small 75 ml sample, send that to the lab, they will culture it and tell you to what degree of infection you have of American Foulbrood. Important that it's not just from one hive, that it's from a whole apiary, or if you've got 10 hives, send a pooled sample from the 10 hives. And this is an early indication that one or more hives could be infected. It doesn't tell you exactly which hives, but it's a good indication. Either there's no AFB spores, so I don't have to worry, or there could be, and I need to do a thorough inspection of these hives. It's probably an inevitability in your career as a beekeeper at some stage. You will get some type of bee disease in your hives. So important to know how to manage it. With American Foulbrood, it is your legal responsibility under the Australian Honeybee Industry Code of Practice that you make that hive bee-proof within 24 hours and take steps to process that hive either through incineration or irradiation. So once you have an infected hive, you need to wait until there is no more flight by field bees. So that could be dusk. If it's quite a cold day or a rainy day, then you can close the hive up earlier, but you want to ensure that all foragers are back in the hive because they will have spores on them. And if you close the hive up and the foragers just drift to the hives on either side of them, guess what could happen? You may have transmitted American Foulbrood from the infected hive to uninfected nearby hives. So you'd seal the hive up. In this case, euthanizing bees in Australia is recommended by pouring a cup of petrol over the bees in the frames, closing the lid very quickly. So this is a quick operation. It's a quick means of fumigating and euthanizing that hive in the quickest way possible. freezing is not a good recommended method because that hive generates its own heat, remember. So freezing a hive will take a long time. It's not the most humane way of euthanizing a colony. If you're wanting to reuse the equipment, obviously you won't want to use petrol, so there's an alternate method of killing bees in a mix of soapy water. So soapy water kills insects, so you'll need to shake all the bees into that soapy water. We'll talk about those methods of eradicating American foulbrood. So if irradiation facilities do exist, as they do in the eastern states of Australia and on the east coast of the US, those are the ones that I do know of. You can irradiate hive equipment, and irradiation is safe. There are no residues once that hive has been processed, and it does kill all spores, fungal pathogens in that hive material, and it can be reused safely. So the image on the right is a hive where the bees have been euthanized using soapy water, so there's no more bees in this colony. There's no honey as well. Irradiation facilities don't want you sending in capped honey. There's a slight heating which happens, and the cappings can pop open and honey gets everywhere. So when it goes for irradiation, you want to plastic wrap it or put it in a container that the irradiation facility provides to you and get it to that facility. With AFB eradication by fire, obviously you can't reuse the equipment after that. It's incinerating all those spores and burying. So recommended with that you don't do it in an urban location. So that could be a logistical challenge for you, which I'm sure you're up for. So you'll need to dig a hole. 30 centimeters deep is recommended in Australia so that it prevents wax and honey from escaping, and then burying that material after burning so that hives can't access it and rot it out. So once it's incinerated, you would cover that hole with soil so that bees can't access that burnt material. So thanks so much for your time, and good luck.